This is your AP Macro video on Ceteris Paribus. So when we do economic models like supply and demand graphs, that is just a visual representation of what the market looks like with buyers and sellers coming together. When we do these economic models, we're trying to isolate the effects of one particular situation on the market. In real life, there are millions of things going on all at the same time that are all affecting the economy. That would be impossible for us to show in any one particular economics problem. So what we try to do is create a graph and then based on the question, isolate this one particular thing to see where it happens to affect the market. We call this Ceteris Paribus. Everything else is held constant except for the thing in the question. So just assume, unless it says otherwise, that nothing else is changing at the same time. Now, what that means is that unless the question is specifically talking about these things, that assume there's no changes to taxes or to government spending. So the government's balancing its budget and only spending what they brought in taxes. Assume that the interest rate is set by the free market, so based on supply and demand of money, borrowed money, or things like government bonds. We also assume that it's a closed economy, so no imports or exports. Certainly those things are not changing unless it's the topic of the question. You can, however, make the assumption that if spending changes, it's going to change the amount of things produced. So, for example, if demand rises, suppliers are going to want to increase the quantity of things that they offer to the customers. So just like when we shift demand to the right and the whole demand line increases, the quantity supplied also goes up with it. So suppliers are meeting the new demand, but just at one quantity, not the entire supply at all prices. So you can make that assumption that changes in spending, whether they go up or down, will affect how much output or quantity is produced. So we're going to do a new graph. This is called aggregate supply and demand. And aggregate just means to total or sum up. So it's the same as your market supply and demand, but now we're adding together all of the goods and services in the whole economy at the same time. So this is a huge aggregate supply and demand graph for the entire United States. So the vertical axis is now going to be called price level instead of just price, because this is going to be the general level of all consumer prices in the whole economy. Remember, we measure consumer prices through the CPI. The horizontal axis, which used to be quantity, is now going to be how many things we're producing in the whole country. That is real gross domestic product. Real GDP also can be talked about in terms of output. So we denote that with a Y in economics. So Y also means income. So this is the income of the country or how much output we're producing. You're also going to have three lines on your graph. So your upward sloping line, supply points to the sky. We're now going to call this short run aggregate supply. So SRAS is the short run supply graph or line. The vertical one is the long run aggregate supply, and that's vertical. And then demand is downward sloping like normal with an aggregate demand. You'll notice that all of these are labeled sub 1. And then of course we mark the equilibrium as well. So this would be price level 1. The vertical long run aggregate supply line, we label wherever that vertical line is, we label that with Y sub N. And N stands for the natural rate of unemployment. This is also referred to as full employment. Hopefully you remember this from our previous units, that the natural rate of unemployment is kind of the long-term average unemployment, the maximum we can have before we trigger inflation. That typically for the US is somewhere around 4 or 5%. Now, the long-run supply line labeled YN, this is kind of our goal for where we want to be in the long run. But in real life, we function in the short run. The X is your typical current graph of short run supply and aggregate demand. Aggregate demand always functions in the short run. We currently have our x directly on top of our long run line. So our equilibrium is in what we call full employment equilibrium. But it is possible for our x to be to the right or to the left of that vertical line.